Mr. President, Sunday was a perfect Chicago afternoon, not in terms of weather, which has not been too kind to us lately, but in terms of my events on the schedule. My first stop was at Navy Pier for the Lithuanian Independence Day celebration, an event which was important to me personally because my mother was born there, and I happened to be on hand for the latest round of independence in Lithuania when the Soviet Union was finally dispelled and this country was allowed to stand on its feet. It was a great celebration with regional food you might expect and dancing and music. I left there to go over to a section of Chicago known as Ukrainian Village. I'd asked after church on Sunday if my friends in the Ukrainian American community would come gather and we would invite a telephone call from Kiev from the American ambassador, Jeffrey Pyatt. I expected a nice crowd. I didn't expect an overflow crowd, but that's what I found. The concern of Ukrainian Americans and many others about the situation in that country is very intense and very personal. Many of them have family members there, strong cultural and family ties, and they're worried, very worried. And so the ambassador called in and gave a few moments of remarks and then answered questions. And then we met later to talk about some of the possibilities as we considered the future of Ukraine. I looked through the audience and found many of my Polish friends, many of my Lithuanian friends, friends from all of the different ethnic groups which had endured some form of Soviet or Russian aggression in the past. They felt bonded with the people of Ukraine and Ukrainian Americans as we discussed this. I had hoped, Mr. President, a few weeks ago that we'd turn the corner in Ukraine, that the difficult events of the last few months were coming to an end. But that didn't happen. We saw horrific violence in Maidan Square, and sadly, many innocent people killed. Just as Ukraine seemed to be emerging from this difficult period with the departure of President Yanukovych, the Russians moved into Crimea. I think that situation has moderated some. I don't know, it changes by the hour. But their decision to have a show of force in Crimea is one we cannot ignore. That operation in Crimea was so well orchestrated that it had to have been planned by Russian President Vladimir Putin during the 22nd Winter Olympic Games hosted in Sochi, Russia. Can anyone imagine anything so crass or brazen as to lavishly try to present Russia to the world as a peaceful and modern Olympic nation while secretly planning a military occupation of another neighboring country? The Russian taxpayers should get their $51 billion back that they paid to set up the Olympics. It was money wasted by Vladimir Putin to try to create an impression of a Russia which sadly does not exist. Mr. President, former Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych, freely elected, also squandered an historic opportunity to further modernize Ukraine, to overcome corruption, and to lift the aspirations of his people. He unnecessarily and cynically divided his nation, and instead of strengthening economic and political ties with Europe, reforming his economy, and respecting Ukraine's historical ties to Russia, he set off to become a pawn of Moscow. He saw his survival politically teaming up with Vladimir Putin. As the emerging pictures from Yanukovych's opulent palace illustrate, he enriched himself personally and his enablers while allowing the country's promising yet troubled economy to deteriorate. Ultimately, his government led a bloody assault on their own people, using heavily armed snipers to massacre Ukrainian people in the streets of Kiev. I met with Mr. Yanukovych and many in his government just a year and a half ago. Yanukovych said that he truly saw his country's future with greater ties to the West. But under enormous Russian pressure, he was unable to let go of his own political grudges and terrified of transparency that an association agreement with the European Union would mean for his corrupt regime, he ultimately put his own political future ahead of the needs of the Ukrainian people. We all know the likely tragic consequences of such self-serving political calculations. Just look at President Assad in Syria or President Maduro in Venezuela. The results in Ukraine were no different. I understand that the Crimean region of Ukraine has a long, complicated history. I understand that then Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev actually gave Crimea to the Ukrainian Republic in 1954, probably never imagining the collapse of the Soviet Union and an independent Ukraine to follow. Let's be clear about what happened. Ukraine wasn't joining NATO. Ukraine wasn't joining the European Union. Ukraine wasn't proposing cutting off its economic and political ties with Russia. Ukraine was simply contemplating signing a long-negotiated trade agreement with the European Union. And for that rationale alone, Vladimir Putin decided to militarily invade and occupy Ukraine. Now, I know Mr. Putin says he was protecting Russian citizens, but there have been no credible examples of threats to any Russian citizens in Ukraine. In fact, the New York Times reported this week that Russian tourists have been sent to eastern Ukraine, where they're stirring up anger and resentment against the Ukrainian government in Kiev. Arguing that Russia can militarily invade another country anytime to protect Russian people is an ominous suggestion that raises alarms for independent sovereign nations all along the Russian borders, and also raises the chapters of history back in the middle of the 20th century, which we need not recount here in detail. One need only look at the two regions of Georgia, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, that have been militarily occupied by Russia since 2008. Russia continues to illegally occupy these areas and has erected fences along administrative lines and permanent military bases in violation of the ceasefire agreement negotiated with the European Union. Now, I've been there myself, and I've seen the deeply troubling permanent bases and boundary fences in Georgia. The president of the Republic of Georgia came to see me the day after the final ceremonies at Sochi, at the Olympic ceremonies, and he said there was a report that morning after the final ceremony that the Russians were stringing barbed wire around the perimeters of the places they were occupying in Georgia. Russia even stopped some of the demarcation during the Olympics, but started, as I've said again, after the game's conclusion. Russian actions in Ukraine and Georgia are a clear violation of international obligations and treaties. For example, Russia was a signatory to the 1994 Budapest Memorandum. That reaffirmed its commitment to Ukraine to respect the independence and sovereignty and existing borders of that nation, to refrain from the threat or use of force against territorial integrity or political independence of Ukraine, to refrain from economic coercion, to subordinate Ukraine to Russia's interest, and to consult in the event a situation arises that raises a question concerning these commitments. Remember why the Budapest Memorandum was entered into by Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom as well as Ukraine. It was entered into because the Ukrainians were surrendering their nuclear weapons. They had decided to give up their nuclear arsenal as long as they had an assurance that they would be protected and their sovereignty would be respected. Russians signed on and then summarily ignored it by basically an act of aggression in Crimea in this last week. In 1997, the Russian Federation and Ukraine signed a friendship treaty. It was during that time that Russian President Boris Yeltsin said in Kiev, "We respect and honor the territorial integrity of Ukraine." As a participating state in the final act of the Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe in 1975, Russia committed to respect the sovereign equality and individuality of other participating states. Mr. President, it is clear that in many respects, Russia has violated the very agreements it signed. It has shown an act of aggression in a sovereign nation of Ukraine.